Well, hello and welcome again to the Purple Inspiration Podcast. This is a space for extraordinary women leaders who rise above the noise. And today, my guest is not only a community leader, but what I call a badass in California law enforcement. Her name is Mary Knox. Mary is a lifelong resident of Contra Costa County. She's worked as a prosecutor for the past 40 years. In addition to prosecuting violent career criminals, Mary has created intervention programs designed to reduce violence in our communities and has brought positive path programs into schools to improve outcomes for our children. During her career, Mary has witnessed the impact of changes in our laws on public safety and on crime victims. She serves as president of the board of Get Vocal for Victims, an organization that provides pro bono legal representation to the victims of crime. She is committed to the criminal justice process, serving also as president of the 100 Club of Contra Costa County, a club that provides financial support to families of police officers and firefighters killed in the line of duty. She is on the advisory board of Pillars of Hope, which provides emergency resources to victims of human sex trafficking, and has been a leader in these spaces against criminals and against human trafficking. So welcome, Mary. We're so proud to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you, Judy. It really is a pleasure to be here with you.
So you've worked on some of the toughest crimes in the toughest cities, prosecuting violent career criminals. And many of these people are repeat offenders who commit some of the most serious and aggressive crimes against others. They have multiple offenses, they have multiple felony convictions, they have a pattern of behavior, and they often become more aggressive and more severe. So I'm curious, how did you choose this line of work, and what does it actually take to do this type of work?
Well, Judy, when I was in law school, I ended up doing a clerkship for the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. And my first clerkship was in the sexual assault unit when the McMartin preschool case came in for filing. And that investigation was mind-boggling. The amount of abuse that was being suffered by the children in a preschool where they were supposed to be protected. And I did another clerkship in the juvenile court in Los Angeles when the Bloods and the Crips basically went to war against each other, and they were using the juveniles to carry their guns. And I just being in the courtroom and watching those prosecutors, I was originally intending to go into oil and gas law that really requires no courtroom experience, but it was fascinating to me. So when I came home right after finishing law school, I clerked in the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. And it was the interaction with crime victims that really hooked me on prosecution. It's very challenging work. I'm very shy as a person, so appearing in court was a little challenging for me, but it's the impact on the crime victims that's kept me in this super rewarding career for 40 years. And just was in a sentencing this morning with a homicide victim's family and his 2 teenage children and his wife. And just being able to give them a sense of justice. I can't change the outcome of what's happened, but at least their voices are now being heard in court.
I find it fascinating, and I know you've worked in some really tough cities, Richmond, California being one of them, LA, certainly a tough city. And I'm curious, so you work with or prosecute against some of these terribly violent criminals who do horrible things, the things that we don't want to. I remember growing up as a child with the Manson murders, and there are so many people that you just have to say, gosh, they keep committing these crimes, they keep getting away from things. Do you ever get death threats? How does that work in your profession? I'm really curious about that.
I have received death threats. In fact, one weekend I was basically under house arrest with my house surrounded by district attorney office inspectors. A defendant who I had prosecuted for a gang sodomy ended up in custody in state prison with a defendant who's a Hell's Angel that I prosecuted for attempted murder of 2 Richmond police officers during a search warrant service. And the defendant that had committed the sex crimes became convinced, or maybe he actually was hired to kill me by the Hells Angel. And he came up for parole, and he was actually released. And so he was released without any controls over him. So the moment that my office heard he'd been released, then I basically had to go into lockdown until they could find him and arrest him.
I mean, that's scary. And, you know, I really give you a lot of credit. I mean, I understand if you're in this line of business, maybe it's not as scary to you because you go through it every day, but I really admire you for the work that you do. I mean, how do you you go through something like that and you got, you know, the good guys surrounding your house against bad guys. How do you actually unwind from that? I mean, you know, I'm really curious because I know you're very committed to what you do.
You know, Judy, I've been asked this question in the past, and so I've given it some thought. And I think the best I can come up with is there just is so much reward in what I do that it makes the downsides really not seem so important. I think my primary concern is always my family. And I've been in situations in the courthouse with defendants or with defendants' families, but they pass pretty quickly. And I've really prided myself on being incredibly ethical and treating defendants with respect and with dignity and being thoughtful to their families who are going through very trying times too. So I think that perhaps that has kept me off the front lines of the threats and the direct threats. And so, yeah, it's a unique situation being able to be in our community and feel like everything that I'm doing in my workday is somehow impacting the public safety and people's abilities to live happy and productive lives.
Well, I think that's amazing. And I have to say, we all strive, I hope most people strive to treat people with dignity and respect, whether or not they are the most severe criminal. Because we do sometimes forget that behind that person that committed that horrible crime is a family who may have nothing to do with it and who may be completely innocent and they have to suffer as well. So I really am appreciative of your approach on that. Let's talk a little bit about Get Vocal for Victims. So this gives you a chance to work with victim advocates and attorneys who volunteer. They give their time pro bono to represent victims of crimes. And, you know, I used to remember back in the day when criminals were criminals and victims were victims. And now I sometimes feel like the victims are portrayed in the media as criminals and the criminals got to get a pass. So I'm curious, what do you see? What kind of things have changed in law enforcement when it comes to victims' rights?
Judy, I've worked under a number of former district attorneys here in Contra Costa County, and our priority was always enforcing our crime victims' constitutional rights. Mm-hmm. I think it's perhaps a little known fact that crime victims have the right to be heard. It's a California constitutional right, and they're co-equal to the rights that a defendant enjoys in the courtroom. And so under former district attorneys, that was complying with Marcy's Law was like our top requirement in this office. And under the current progressive district attorney, literally a family whose grandmother, aunt, sister, who was 83 years old, she was beaten to death in her home in Richmond, and she was raped. Mm. And the man who was prosecuted for her murder was convicted, and he was sentenced to death. And that sentence was appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court and affirmed in every court. And in 2016, in a kind of a Hail Mary writ to the Ninth Circuit, one justice was of the opinion that there was evidence he wasn't competent to stand trial when he was prosecuted. despite the testimony of defense psychiatrists at the penalty phase. So he overturned that conviction, and under the former DA, Mark Peterson, I worked with the Attorney General's office to appeal that, and we made the commitment to them. And this was when Paul Holes was still in my office and was helping with the DNA evidence. We made the commitment that we would retry the case, which we could absolutely do because we had trial transcripts. So Mr. Peterson left the office and the current DA came into office. And when the Attorney General's office was not successful with the appeal, the DA cut a deal with the Public Defender's office that literally walked this man off death row. And then he was returned to the town that he was from in the Midwest, and he'd left there because he was a suspect in the rape of a teenage girl. And when he was returned to that town, that girl was not advised of the fact, she's now a woman, that he was coming back to her jurisdiction. And that the victim family of the original murder found out that he'd been released off of death row when a story ran in the East Bay Times. So Marcy's law rights were completely violated. And so prosecutors in my office worked to try and reverse this. But it became apparent that even though victims have this constitutional right to be heard and noticed, there's no remedy if their Marcy's law rights are violated. Yeah. So we decided that's how Get Vocal for Victims was born. Everyone in the courtroom is represented and has an attorney. But when the district attorney's office is not representing the crime victims, they're the only ones in the courtroom without a voice. So we incorporated into a nonprofit, and we thought at the beginning that we would just be representing people, crime victims, through the court process. But we now have been representing families, for example, Alexis Gabe's family during the investigation of her murder. And then we've appeared with crime victim families at parole hearings, even on a decision to reverse a parole board decision that went to the governor's office. So we found all different kinds of niches where crime victims absolutely need to have someone representing them to ensure that the voices are heard. And we've had the tremendous good fortune to have retired judges join us as volunteers and retired prosecutors. So we have some really talented attorneys in the mix to represent crime victims.
I mean, I think what you're doing is amazing. I'm so proud of you for doing it. And I know, these victims really do deserve their day in court, as we say. And I just have to, give a shout out. I have seen Paul Holes speak, and as I recall, he was the one that helped frame the Golden State murder.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, quite a story there for sure.
Yes, he's very talented.
Yeah. So, all right, well, let's pivot just a little bit. I get worried about early release. We just had a case in California where someone was granted early release who clearly should not have been let out. And it kind of sounds like, the old Monopoly game, the get out of jail free card. And there seems to be this new strategy, or current, I guess, strategy among progressive activists that protects the criminals through these early release programs. So it's less about punishment and more about rehabilitation. And, we all want everyone to have a second chance. I mean, we talk about second chances. We talk about a third act as you get older. Of course we want that. But in reality, are these progressive early release programs and these restorative justice programs having a positive impact on society and on law enforcement? Or does it hamper your ability to do your job on behalf of the victims?
Perhaps I could give you an example of, I'm currently in our homicide unit, and out of the 10 cases that I'm carrying, 4 of those defendants have been prosecuted in the past for murders. One of those defendants had 4 prior strike convictions, meaning he's been convicted of violent felonies in the past. Then he was sentenced to 19 years for kidnapping his girlfriend and then shoving the barrel of a gun into her mouth as has her confined into this truck. And so he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. So under Prop 57, a parole board who had no legal training decided that that was not a violent felony and that he was entitled to early release. So he was released after serving about 3 years in prison on a 19-year sentence. So when he paroled, he committed an armed robbery. Then he was released, even though he's on parole, he was released without posting any bail on the armed robbery. Then he failed to appear in court on the armed robbery, and the judge did not issue an arrest warrant for him. He committed another armed robbery, and so was taken into custody. And then he was released yet again, and then he was firing rounds at his girlfriend's parents' house and knew the police were on their way. So as someone pulled in a customer to buy drugs from him, he jumped into that van and had his customer drive him to a local mini mart where a clerk who was brought here by the U.S. Army because he'd worked in Afghanistan as an interpreter for the U.S. Army, who had 5 children, the youngest of whom was 2, was working as a clerk there at the mini mart. And I won't go into all the details because it's all so ridiculous, no one would believe it, but it's all over a muddy shoe. So defendant grabs his gun out of the van, comes marching in with the gun drawn, and shoots the clerk in the heart. And he dies in front of this store full of people who are screaming, not knowing if they're going to be the next to die. So that's an example of the type of criminals that are benefiting from the cashless bails, just being released without any conditions, and this continued focus on emptying our prisons of people who are clearly violent and have spent their entire adult lives committing crimes of violence.
I mean, it's also amazing to me to watch this unfold. And I think we all worry about it. Those of us that live in, counties that have urban, large populations, I just don't even know how to say it other than, I hope that we can do a better job, perhaps in our neighboring county with by reelecting Ursula Jones Dixon, for example, someone who actually understands victims' rights, and is an amazing person. So hopefully she can get in, and hopefully we can perhaps make a change in a future date in our county and some of the others. I mean, everything about law enforcement now, I'm so appreciative of what you do. I'm so appreciative of what our police do, what our firefighters do, everyone to keep us safe. But when you've got these people who are let up too early and who, don't understand, they're more worried about their own rights than they are taking away the rights of someone else. It just, breaks my heart. So I don't want to end though on a sad note. So tell me something positive. Tell me about a case you worked on where you felt, really good, or give me an example, maybe through what you've done with Get Vocal for Victims that maybe we can end on a positive note here.
Sometimes it's hard in my work to find something that other people would perceive as positive. But one thing I was thinking about, I prosecuted 3 defendants for human trafficking that were operating in the east end of our county, and were so incredibly brutal that none of the women that they were trafficking would talk about them to law enforcement while they were on their streets. They would shave women's heads. They would form all of the trafficking victims that were together in one residence to like group beat down another girl to punish her. There were just brutal sex crimes. One girl was burnt with heated clothes iron to the point where she ended up hospitalized. They were breaking arms. And one of the women who helped run these houses, I heard her name constantly as a DA. She had so many criminal cases pending, and she ended up, in order to prosecute these guys, one went back to prison on a parole violation, one got arrested for a murder, and one went into federal custody for human trafficking. And then all of our trafficked women, we moved out of state. And this one particular, she took a position as a witness as opposed to a charged victim. All of them, 100%, they turned their lives around. All they required, really, Judy, there was some drug counseling involved, but it really was, in my opinion, people believed in them. And that made such a dramatic difference. And when the witness came and she testified against these guys and corroborated what the human trafficking victims, charged victims, had testified to, the defense attorney was very mocking of her, and basically was, asking her if she was employed. And Jessie sat up a little higher in the witness stand and she said, "Yeah, I am employed. And as a matter of fact, they think I'm doing such a good job, they promoted me to manager." And she's married now. She's like, all of them have just totally turned their lives around. And it was amazing to me that they could go from such desperate situations where they couldn't walk the streets except for at night, afraid that they were going to be kidnapped by these traffickers. And their success, that felt really good.
That's amazing. And, trafficking is like domestic violence. Trafficking is one of those things that happens in every community. I remember in Danville, California, where I live, which is considered the safest city in California, we had one of the worst trafficking incidents here. And people sometimes don't realize, could be your neighbor. Be vigilant, watch out. What would you, and that's, kind of my philosophy, but what other things can people do, especially if they think they see someone being trafficked? What do they look out for? What are the warning signs?
So, and I was in trial on my trafficking case when Spider was in trial on the Danville case.
Yeah.
And so there was a very stark contrast between my witnesses and then the witnesses that had been trafficked by that man. They were being flown across the country, having their hair done in Manhattan beauty salons. And on the day he was arrested, he pulled up in front of his house in a brand new Rolls Royce. So the amount of money involved in this on, different ends, but sometimes it's difficult to see, but literally women are being flown from Oakland to Las Vegas and trafficked. When you see like the control, I think that the main factor is the control. I remember very well respected human trafficking detective would talk to me about when they were out on the streets. Now it's known as where prostitutes are being run. It's known as the Blade now. But like down on International Boulevard in Oakland, whenever he said, all I would do, Mary, was talk to the women out on the streets and watch their eyes. And their eyes would move to where the pimp was. Like in the adjoining motel room, in a car, because it's this constant control over everything the women are doing. So it's, as simple as looking at tattoos. Like, pimps will tattoo women's hands and their necks with the pimp's names and things like that. But I've heard stories of just clerks in convenience stores seeing how a woman was just being controlled by a man in the store, and then just simply like underneath their breath saying, "Do you need help?" And like it really, it's a very profound degradation of these women's self-esteem. And the physical side apart, it's the destruction of their self-esteem. I think that's so incredibly disturbing.
All right. Well, Mary Knox, you really care about young women, especially victims who need your help the most. You're making sure their voices are heard. I am so proud of the work you do. I'm so proud to be your friend, and so grateful to you. Thank you so much, Mary.